Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. My name is Jasleen Kaur, and I'm a researcher and transcreator at Sikh Research Institute, and I work on the Guru Granth Sahib project. Today, I'm going to be talking to you all about Asa Ki Var, Guru Nanak's Asa Ki Var, which can be translated as the Song of Hope. But before I do that, I wanted to explain a bit what transcreation is and give you an example of how we do that work. So transcreation is a version of translating that does not require literalism. It doesn't require you to be technically correct about everything. It allows you to take liberties in order to convey the spirit of the Bani instead of just mapping things out directly. And the reason that's really important is because in the original Banis, sometimes the words that we have there carry different baggage in English when we try to translate them so literally. So an example of that is how we translate IkOankar. And most of the time, IkOankar is translated as one God. Literally, that doesn't really work. And it doesn't, in our opinion, really capture the spirit of what that means. So we've translated it and transcreated it as one creative and pervasive force, because we're all part of this vastness that runs through everything. And that's a little bit more accessible and more in line with the Sikh worldview than the idea of a kind of Judeo-Christian God who, looks over all of us, waiting to judge us on the last day. So every morning, Guru Nanak's Asa Ki Var is sung in order to help us center ourselves for the day and process the world around us. In 41, Guru Nanak Sahib writes that the wisdom of the Guru helps us turn from ordinary human beings into divine-like beings, beings with IkOankar-like virtues. Part of what Asa Ki Var is known for is that it serves as a commentary for a lot of issues that seem to be timeless, like hypocrisy and corruption of the political and religious elite, fear-mongering and othering, the ways that we fall for these things instead of remembering that we're all part of the same vastness, IkOankar. Guru Nanak Sahib says that the population, devoid of wisdom, is being plundered and eaten away at by death. He also says that because of all these things we fall for, we lose sight of IkOankar, of the one universal integrative force that holds all of us together, that we're all a part of. And because of that, we wander in circles. He relates this to a spinning wheel or a butter churner, any of these things that kind of go in circles again and again. And we can interpret that as a statement about the circular nature of history too. There are so many things that tend to be kind of timelessly relevant about Asa Ki Var. And I think in the current global, political, and social context that we're living through, we kind of already know a lot of what he said in his commentary to warn us about. We know that those things exist. But I'd like to invite you all to think with me about how to respond, how to change our behaviors so that we can become more like IkOankar, and imbibe more IkOankar-like virtues so that our behaviors change, and hopefully the world around us slowly starts to change as well. In 47, Guru Nanak Sahib uses the word ho again and again in every line, and the way that that's usually translated is as ego. But a lot of times we understand ego as only a negative thing. So the way that we actually transcreated this word is as I-ness, as a sense of self. And we looked at the way that Guru Nanak Sahib plays with ideas of I-ness versus ideas of oneness, which is another way that we can understand IkOankar. Guru Nanak Sahib says that everything that happens on earth, us being born, us dying, laughing, crying, everything that we do happens in ho. It happens in this I-ness. So it's not always a negative thing. There are things that we can do to turn that potential into a positive thing. And that's when we take our sort of self-awareness, our ideas about our small selves, and relate them to the larger self with a big S, or IkOankar, that larger sense of oneness. if we can understand our unique and important existences as human beings on the earth as part of something bigger, then we can kind of resolve the way that I-ness can turn into something negative and keep it as a positive thing that gives back to the oneness. Guru Nanak Sahib says that those of us who have been able to resolve that sense of I-ness and turn it into a sense of oneness are those who identify with the eternal, who contemplate the eternal, and who serve the eternal. Those who have resolved their I-ness are the contented ones. That's what Guru Nanak Sahib says. And he says that because of that, they know where to walk in life. They know where the path is. They know what their principles are. And they live those out in their behaviors every day without having to kind of think twice about it. I think if we have an understanding about what Guru Nanak Sahib is talking about when he's saying that we can turn our I-ness, the potentiality of our sense of self, into an identification with IkOankar, or an identification with oneness, and that can actually change our sense of our principles, and that in turn changes how we behave in the world. I think that understanding can help us better understand the role of hukum, or the divine command, especially as we go through the world and all of its kind of tumultuous things that sometimes we are overwhelmed by. And so I want to bring us to that idea next. So how does Guru Nanak Sahib talk about the command, the divine command? So a lot of times when we talk about hukum, we kind of say that like everything is hukum, and we sort of throw our hands up in the air and let it be as it is. But I want us to figure out how we can act in the world, how we can use our I-ness and our potentiality to make change in the world through our behaviors, and like really understand that we have a role to play. We always have a role to play. Guru Nanak Sahib uses the word be, which actually literally translates as fear, to describe this thing that everything on earth is sort of moving under and moving through. And the way that we transcreated be is as reverence, which then in turn was understood as the divine command. Guru Nanak Sahib says that everything moves under this command. So the rising and setting of the sun, the way that the moon comes into the sky at night, the way that the wind blows, all of these things exist under this divine command. And part of our job as human beings in the world is to be able to tell the difference between the divine command, the command with a capital C, and the smaller commands that exist all around us that are products of time and context. So an example of that would be the smaller command of who your current president is or prime minister is, what your current government is, even who your parents are, who your friends are. All these things around us are kind of this like infinite set of commands of time, but the one eternal command that doesn't change no matter what is the command of the divine. And sometimes it's easy for us to get distracted by those smaller commands, and that can pull us away from understanding and tuning into what that larger command is telling us. I think if we have a sense of what that larger command is, if we tune into that oneness instead of that I-ness, which can also lead us to othering and falling into fear or anger, the things that we were talking about earlier, I think if we really tune into those larger eternal things like oneness and the larger command, we'll be able to understand how we can use our human lives on earth to affect some kind of change, both internally and externally. And we see that happening. So I'm coming from a US context, and I can say that over the past year, I've seen a lot of people who I know were not previously engaging in organizing or activism really getting into that stuff and really doing the work to involve themselves in affecting some kind of positive change in our political and social worlds. I think sometimes though, especially because we do have so many ways that we can kind of perform for other people, we have social media, we have things like Twitter and Instagram, it's really easy for us, I think, to perform activism or perform even introspection, which Guru Nanak Sahib asks us to do. He asks us to be introspective. But sometimes we think that being introspective is enough, and we think that that's the ending point instead of the starting point. Guru Nanak Sahib is very clear. He says, like, you need to really take a look at the world around you, critically think about it, right? And then also think about how you're responding to it. So that's where your introspection comes. But then he also says that we have to change our behaviors. And the way that we change our behaviors, it's not an easy thing. It takes a lot of hard work. And it means that we have to sometimes unlearn a lot of things that we've taken to be truths. And so I wanted to talk a bit about the ways that we can sometimes perform our activism or our introspection and then not really change much about what we're putting out into the world at all. And so Guru Nanak Sahib talks about this. He talks about how to become a lover of the beloved, because that's what Asa Ki Var is trying to teach us to do. The last 4 40s are all about that. And he says that those people who speak tastelessly, and I think some of us maybe understand that as unpleasantly. So those of us who speak unpleasant words, then our entire body becomes unpleasant. Our actions become unpleasant. But the word is actually tasteless or insipid. And so it's not just talking about, in my interpretation, Guru Nanak Sahib is not just talking about people who speak horrible things or unpleasant things. He's also talking about people who maybe say really lovely things. Maybe they say all the right things. But ultimately what they're saying doesn't have any substance behind it. It's empty. And I think it's easy for all of us to do that because we have access to so many things that help us do that without maybe realizing it. So if I post on my Instagram story that, like, I'm going to a protest later, and then I don't go, that's an example of, like, tasteless words. Maybe that's a simple way to understand it. But maybe a more complicated way is I'll relate it to, like, something that I've seen in the recent past, because we just had our election in the United States, and a lot of people that did a lot of that work maybe 6 months ago in trying to educate themselves on progressive politics and things like that, kind of dropped all those politics out the window after we had our election. And that's not to say that I agree or disagree with it, but it was interesting to me that those things kind of seem to be easier to do because we have things like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram kind of at our disposal. So Guru Nanak Sahib doesn't condemn people who speak tastelessly, but he does say that introspection that you think is the ending point is actually the starting point, and it's a continuous thing that you have to do even as your behaviors are changing. So any of us can fall into that. Any of us can say, well, I've changed my behaviors and I'm identifying with IkOankar and I'm loving everybody and showing that through my actions. And still we can have days where we fall into speaking tastelessly. So that's something that I wanted to touch on a little bit. And then I also wanted to talk about something that Guru Nanak Sahib says after he talks about that tasteless speaking. And he says, everything happens under your command. We come and go under your command. Everything that is fulfilled or not fulfilled happens in your will. But he follows that up by saying it is up to us as human beings to make our own destinies, to kind of take our lives and do with them what we will. And I think a lot of times we only talk about hukum as a sort of passive thing that we're all kind of experiencing. And Guru Nanak Sahib actually explicitly says in Asa Ki Var that the command that we understand is true, yes, and it's a reality, but we also have the ability as humans in the world with our I-ness, our potentialities, to act in a way that puts out good things, puts out better things in a way that identifies with IkOankar and fights against all of the different ways that we are sort of told we should feel about each other, and the ways that we divide ourselves again and again, sometimes in ways that are violent. Guru Nanak Sahib gives us guidance on how to respond to the world as we encounter it. He tells us to become lovers of the beloved. And what that means is that we act in a world where we don't keep score, we're not constantly calculating, and we don't have a sense of duality. We have an understanding of IkOankar, of oneness, that permeates all of our actions and the ways that we interact with each other. Guru Nanak Sahib urges us to become lovers of the beloved. He urges us to praise IkOankar, to identify with IkOankar, to identify with the vastness of IkOankar, and to be in awe at all times, no matter if the thing that we're witnessing is good or bad. Guru Nanak Sahib says that a lover remembers the beloved, a lover praises the beloved in every single one of their actions. A lover remembers the beloved every second of the day. A lover does not calculate, does not scorekeep. A lover has enough foresight to understand the effects of their actions and take all that into account. And a lover of oneness is a person who loves everyone, no matter what, which is not always an easy thing to do, but Guru Nanak Sahib urges us to move towards that understanding every day. Professor Puran Singh writes that Guru Nanak Sahib through Asa Ki Var calls us to our true instinctive goodness. And he says that that true instinctive goodness means that we act out our love in the world every day, and that love is a love rooted in justice and not a love rooted in revenge. It's a love that makes us all better. It's a love that demands better for each other. It's a love that overthrows tyrants, and it's a love that keeps us going even when things feel real hopeless. Professor Puran Singh also says that when we identify with IkOankar, when we remember IkOankar, when we love IkOankar, that's not a passive thing. It's not a meditative thing in the way we might think, where everything is kind of mechanical and we're going through the motions. It's a creative thing. It's a thing that requires us to be creative in the world, to act in the world. And he says that when you're really in love with the beloved, when you really identify with the beloved and remember the beloved, you're overflowing with this love. And that overflowing is something that you have to put out into the world in whatever way that you can, and that will inspire other people too. So I invite you to walk with Asa Ki Var and to let it chisel you from the inside out, to let it change the way that you think about the world around you and the way that you act as a result of that. I invite you to become a lover of the beloved, to identify with IkOankar in any way that you can, to live in remembrance of IkOankar, and to live in awe of the vastness in the best way that you can. And when all that happens and you feel something churning within you, something that feels a lot like love maybe, or inspiration, and it starts to overflow, I invite you to ask yourself if you will be brave enough to let it out and inspire the other people around you, and to make the world more beautiful than it was when you first got here. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.